the end of the session. So if you don't want your photograph taken, that's the point at which you can also turn off your camera if you don't want to be in the photograph. Okay, so at this point I call upon Sister Imelda Poole, who's the president of Renata, to speak on the work of Renata and of the Law Task Group and on the commissioning of this very important research. Over to you, Imelda. Imelda, you're muted.
We say we'll all die saying, I need to unmute. It happens so often in these Zoom meetings, so forgive me. So welcome and hello everyone to this session today. It is such an honor for me to welcome you all, and in particular, this Law Task Group that is one of 10 task groups that are implementing alongside the core group and the board of Renata, the mission, the dynamic mission throughout Europe. Religious in Europe Networking Against Human Trafficking is now in collaboration with St. Mary's University, and in particular the Bakita Center, which is the unit against human trafficking. And we are honored to be in partnership with you. And Carol is there as the director of this center, and you will meet the other members who collaborated with us and led the research. The Law Task Group in Renata is dynamic. There are about 10 members, and they have developed a very significant aim. And I'd like to read this out to you. It's to end all forms of human trafficking and exploitation through the development and implementation of legal protections and remedies, increased access to justice and legal aid, and a holistic, multidisciplinary support for survivors. The members of the Law Task Group are all engaged in their fieldwork day by day in the work of law or advocacy against human trafficking, whilst continuing the direct action with victims and survivors. They're close to the grassroots while absolutely speaking out with them, with the survivors, for justice and for good law. They complement the policy of Renata, which states that Renata endeavours to abolish all forms of human trafficking and exploitation that violates human dignity and rights of persons. Throughout its European network, Renata adopts a victim-centred, human rights, trauma-informed approach in relation to the law, and of course, in relationship with all victims and survivors. So always in collaboration right across the world, obviously, because trafficking is a global problem, and all of us, wherever we live and work in this field, are working in wonderful collaboration with our colleagues across the world. And in this particular webinar, we focus on change of law and also in particular in legal aid assistance. So thank you for being present with us, for being again our collaborators, and we really look forward to this particular event, this webinar, and we thank St. Mary's for their lead.
Thank you very much, Sister Imelda. And now I'm going to call upon Mariana Mesci of the Renata Law Task Group to tell us about how the research came about on this problem in 6 countries. So I'm going to hand over to Mariana to explain the background. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Good morning, everybody. I am pleased to present some background to this research on behalf of my wonderful colleagues from the Renata Law Task Group. As Sister Imelda explained, in this task group, we are professionals with long expertise in anti-trafficking, and all of us work hard in our countries and beyond for the protection of victims of trafficking and for enhancing their rights. We as a group of professionals in this field are concerned, and of course are aware, but so much concerned, of the lack of proper victim support and protection according to the law in Europe. And in our grassroots work, we have experienced many obstacles in providing support and ensuring access to justice for victims of trafficking, and especially in ensuring the right to legal aid for them. We have concerns on the lack of accomplishment of this right for many victims of trafficking, and also we have been concerned to the quality of legal aid for those that receive this support, and for the qualification of the professionals that provides this support. Another issue concerning this group is the gap between those victims who can access the legal aid and those who cannot, and this is for many complex reasons. So we came to the need for this research, even due to the lack of data and clear picture of the legal aid services for victims of trafficking in Europe. And we think that providing a clear understanding of the current situation for legal support for victims of trafficking is required in order to take the proper actions for improving this support. We see that despite the political will and the measures that different European countries have undertaken, still the need for legal aid and the situation of legal aid is not properly understood. So Renata Law Task Group therefore want to contribute to the knowledge about this important topic and provide a clear picture of the current situation for victims of trafficking in Europe. And as Sister Imelda explained, we collaborated, and we are very grateful for the collaboration with Bakita Center at Santa Mary University in UK to conduct the research that we are introducing today, called Legal Aid Support for Victims of Trafficking Across Europe, with special focus in 6 countries. We started this initial research with 6 European countries in which Renata operates. And we, as a task group, choose to do the research, this initial research for Albania, Bulgaria, England and Wales, Germany, Romania, and Spain, as they represent both even the origin, even destination countries for victims of trafficking. And all these countries are signatories to the Councils of Europe Convention, which emphasize the obligation of state parties for providing legal aid for victims of trafficking. And also I would like to mention that in Renato Law Task Group, we have representatives from all these 6 countries whom contributed significantly to the research. The research aimed to shed light on the provision of legal aid for victims of trafficking and to provide an overall picture of the availability and quality of legal assistance for victims of trafficking across these countries by identifying key obstacles and best practices. We hope that this research will serve to anti-trafficking stakeholders and will offer a good picture and practical recommendations that can be used to advocate for change in participating countries and in Europe. So on behalf of Renato Law Task Group, I would like to thank Bakita Center for collaboration and to congratulate the researchers for the great work in presenting this clear analysis of legal provision in these countries. And thanks to everybody that is present today. We are looking forward to joining efforts on advocating for improving the legal rights for victims of trafficking in Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mariana. And now I invite the team from the Bakita Center for Research on Slavery, Exploitation and Abuse at St Mary's University, Twickenham, London. I call on Dr. Carol Murphy, the Acting Director of the Centre, and Anta Braku and Diem Tam Tru. So I'll hand over now to Carol to lead on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's really fantastic to be here with you all this morning. I'll just give you a little bit of background just in case you don't know about the Bakita Centre. So the Bakita Centre for Research on Slavery, Exploitation and Abuse was named after St. Josephine Bakita, who's the patron saint of trafficking, trafficked from the Sudan as an 8-year-old girl in the late 19th century. We launched the centre in 2021 at St. Mary's University, but it was continuing the work of the Centre for the Study of Modern Slavery that was launched in 2015 to recognise, we wanted to recognise the development of a broader research remit that takes account of intersections with other forms of human trafficking and modern slavery. One of the things that we wanted to address here, of course, is why the focus on legal assistance for victims. Well, for us, it fits in really with the broader focus of the centre. One of the reasons for changing the name really was that we wanted to move away from the term modern slavery, as it's a term that's particularly used in the UK, but not internationally, and certainly not in Europe. So we wanted to recognise that, and also how it links in with broader exploitation and inequality. And in that regard, I really want to say that I was so happy to hear Sister Imelda each time she said human trafficking, she said, and exploitation. And I think that's really important because there are lots of forms of exploitation that might not be recognised as modern slavery, for example, or human trafficking. We also were really wanting to expand our international reach. And of course, most importantly, our focus is on supporting victims to receive justice and to support them in full recovery. There were 3 kind of key issues that we wanted to look at in this study, with guidance, of course, from Renata, to be able to provide some context and try to answer the question, what is the situation on legal support for victims of trafficking in these 6 countries? We wanted to also provide understanding in terms of how legal aid works in each of these countries. And the third thing that we wanted to do was to explore challenges with this scoping review in order to then promote and inform advocacy. Working on this rapid response study, because it was commissioned by Renata and conducted in a short time, researchers Dean Tu Tran, who was the lead researcher, and Anta Brakau have produced a valuable evidence-based report that highlights the many disparities in legal aid for survivors of trafficking across Europe. This task was supported by the expertise of the Renata Task Group on Law and Law Enforcement, and it was through their guidance and accessing their networks that made this study possible in such a short time. We hope that this report will shed light on the already existing barriers and encourage new partnerships to be formed to truly support victims to receive justice in a way that recognises their human rights and right to dignity. From my personal perspective and underpinning the values of the centre, we believe that partnerships between academics, researchers, campaigners, practitioners, and civil society are more and more necessary to ensure victims receive justice in their quest for recovery. We feel that this is an excellent starting point from which to move forward in collaboration with Renata and to be able to use our expertise and our applied research to develop solutions. So finally, the team at the Bakita Centre hope to continue to support the invaluable work of Renata going forward. And I will now, I believe, hand over to my colleague, Anta.
Thank you, Carol, and thanks everyone for pulling together this event. So I'll briefly cover the methodology of the scoping review, and then we'll move on to the summary of the findings of the report. So for this particular study, we conducted a scoping review of the relevant literature across the 6 countries. So we looked at key reports, legislative acts, and also national and international policy documents on the legal assistance situation in all the selected countries. The objective of this type of review was to identify and map evidence that is available about the subject matter, and therefore provide a broader scope or overview of the existing literature and data. In the review, as it is characteristic for a scoping exercise, the results are mapped and presented in a descriptive way rather than interpreted through meta-analysis. However, given the lack of comparative studies on legal aid legal aid support for victims of trafficking in the selected European countries that we've looked at, this scoping review was useful for examining the emerging evidence and highlighting both good practice, but also the challenges at international and national level. This scoping review references quite a few key reports and legislation across the 6 countries, which are obviously crucial in understanding the landscape of legal aid in the various jurisdictions. So we do encourage readers to further and independently explore these reports and documents in order to gain a deeper understanding of the multiple issues and difficulties that might present in the various countries. The scoping review was then also complemented by an online survey in order to evaluate the current legal aid support from the viewpoint of practitioners. The survey was disseminated to relevant actors and stakeholders who work in the anti-trafficking sector in the respective 6 countries. And the Renate Law Task Group members provided most of the contacts of the service for the various service providers and stakeholders who were then invited to participate in the study. Due to the limited scope and time frame for this research, victims were not invited to complete the survey, but rather through the survey questions, the study sought to understand more about their experiences in relation to legal assistance from the standpoint of practitioners and the feedback that they had received. So we used both open-ended and closed questions, focusing on the challenges and best practices in relation to awareness, access, and quality of legal assistance for victims. So in addition to the scoping review of the literature that I mentioned, the report has 3 thematic sections, which reflect on the experiences and viewpoints of practitioners that participated in the study, and DM2 will shortly summarize these sections on awareness, access, and quality in a minute. Last but not least, the report includes a list of recommendations that we hope will be a tool for dialogue. We hope that it will also be useful for researchers and policymakers. Before I hand over to DM2, I also wanted to echo what Carol mentioned about the power of partnership in research. And I wanted to briefly pause and reflect on this theme. Given the limited time frame, so the study was conducted from April to June this year, this study and report would not have been possible, would not have happened if we did not work in partnership with the Renate Law Task Group and the various other professionals and practitioners that are on the call today. Also, as a research center, we value practice-oriented research. And in order to achieve this, partnership working is always the key. So even for this study, we took an inclusive and participatory approach built obviously on trust and mutual understanding. With the Renate Law Task Group, we had a common understanding of the problem, and that obviously was certainly a good starting point, as Mariana also pointed out. And then we were able to continually exchange ideas and consult with practitioners across the 6 representative countries. Given the reach and the scope of the research, using the wealth of expertise and knowledge available in the Law Task Group, but also the wider Renata network has been invaluable. And as a research team, we are certainly very grateful for this. And similarly, by organizing such an event to disseminate and discuss the report, it's another rewarding aspect of the partnership working, which we hope will maximize the impact of this scoping review, but also foster longer-term partnerships that will further continue this research and do further practical work to support or implement some of the findings. And now I'll hand over to my colleague DM2, who is the lead researcher.
Thank you, Anta. Yeah, good morning, everyone. Yeah, and thank you, Renata, for launching this event and giving us the opportunity really to present the key findings of this research project. So I would like to give an overview of the key findings of this research, and chiefly based on the survey results. So also, many thanks to all the respondents, to the survey, all the people, I believe some of them are present here today. Really taking the time and answering the questions, because otherwise this report again wouldn't have been possible. So first of all, I would like to emphasize that this report was able to capture some of the main challenges and also to highlight the disparities facing victims of trafficking with regards to legal aid across these 6 different countries. And I would also like to mention that victims of trafficking, we have found, receive legal assistance mainly for the purpose of criminal assistance with prosecution and also claiming compensation. And particularly in the context of Germany, Spain, as well as England and Wales, we found that immigration matters are also key reasons why victims seek legal advice in these countries. And this is, of course, not surprising, given that these countries are all relevant destination countries for victims of trafficking. And then furthermore, our comparative analysis shows that victims experience the least challenges when it comes to access legal aid given by NGO-based legal assistance. So this is definitely a positive aspect. But in contrast, there is a very clear need for improvement when we look at provision of legal assistance provided by the government in all these countries. And now I would like to highlight the findings based on the aforementioned 3 key areas of legal assistance. So that is awareness, access, and quality. The aim of the awareness part of the survey was first and foremost to really shed light on how well informed and how aware are victims in terms of their basic rights, but also regarding their entitlement to free legal assistance. On a positive note, we can emphasize that in all these countries, victims do have the right to free legal assistance based on the law. But we also want to stress that this requires that they are first and foremost identified by the authorities as victims of trafficking. And in some cases, they also need to provide evidence that they are actually in need of financial support in order to be able to have this state-funded legal assistance. And so more specifically, this also shows that there are a number of obstacles that victims do face when it comes to being really aware and being informed about legal assistance. And apart from Albania, where victims are more likely to be informed about the rights, the survey findings reveal that officials in the other states only sometimes inform victims about their basic rights after they have been identified as victims of trafficking. So in other words, there are very clear barriers. For example, on the part of the victims, respondents highlighted that victims often have limited language skills, or they lack knowledge about the relevant contacts, so people they can turn to if they want to seek legal advice. And then more importantly, on the part of the government, there are a number of issues in terms of lack of interpreters, legal information is often insufficient, victims often do not understand the information that is given because it's too complex, it's too complicated for people to fully comprehend what rights they actually have. And in the context of Romania, Spain, and Albania, it was prevalent that there's also a lack of trust among victims towards authorities, which again seems to prevent them from accessing legal information in the first place. And then concerning access to legal assistance, one concerning finding is that victims tend to wait between 9 months or even over 12 months to be referred to free legal assistance. This was particularly the case in Romania and Spain. But the waiting time, fortunately, was clearly shorter in other countries, and particularly in Germany and Albania, where they have the shortest periods of maximum 3 months until they could be referred to free legal assistance. And these outcomes are clearly linked to the obstacles to free legal assistance outlined again by the respondents that mainly concern the government policies and also formal processes to to access legal assistance. So, for instance, respondents stress that there are high levels of bureaucracy and there are complex criteria which make it difficult for victims, especially in Bulgaria, to access state-funded legal aid. And this means that this would result in the issue that victims need to seek free legal assistance provided by NGOs, or they even have to go to a private lawyer for assistance. But we also know that NGOs only have very limited capacities and also funding, and therefore in certain countries, victims still are very much dependent on state-funded legal assistance. That, of course, means we need to make sure that state-funded legal assistance is of high quality and accessible to victims. And the response also suggests that obstacles to access free legal assistance are associated with the issues regarding the lack of training and also low payment of lawyers. And this was definitely a problem highlighted in Romania, but also in Germany. And then we also asked the question about repatriated victims and whether they are able to access legal aid once they returned. And respondents from Albania and Bulgaria and Romania, which are all, of course, relevant source countries, they stated that legal assistance for returned victims do exist in their home countries. But then when we look at Germany and Spain, which are mainly receiving countries, and respondents from these regions stated that they have relationships with NGOs in the countries of origin of victims, such as Nigeria, and they also knew of the possibility that victims can pursue pending legal cases in either Germany and Spain or also in their home countries. So I would like just to mention that this area of research, so when it comes to legal aid for repatriated victims, is still a very poorly studied area. But it's still, of course, a pressing matter, given the cross-border nature of trafficking and also the high number of foreign victims in these European countries. So there's definitely more to unpack here. And now lastly, when it comes to the quality of legal aid, then our survey findings show that the positive feedback that we saw mainly referred to the quality of legal assistance provided by the NGOs, as I mentioned at the beginning. And then again, in contrast, there were a lot of negative assessments that mainly concerned the state-funded legal assistance. So when we look at the NGOs, the quality of the legal aid given by NGOs, particularly in Bulgaria, but also Albania and England, Wales, were especially positively evaluated because respondents explained that in these countries, they were able to offer victim-oriented legal advice and clients felt that their interests were defended. This, of course, again, underlines the very vital role that NGOs play in the area of legal assistance for victims of trafficking, and also at the end, yeah, the realization of their rights. But then on the other hand, the quality of state-funded legal assistance was seen, was evaluated very low. And one main issue concerns the lack of qualifications and also very high workloads of state-funded lawyers. Criminal proceedings tend to be very lengthy, and that means that at the end of the day, the interests and needs of the victims are not at the center. And these challenges were especially prevalent for the Romanian and also Bulgarian context. And then one further area we looked at was the possible differences between legal assistance provided in urban and rural areas. So from this regional perspective, our results indicate that there are stark differences when it comes to quality of legal advice between rural and urban settings. And they mainly exist in Bulgaria, Spain, and Germany, and to a lesser degree in Romania. And there was also wide agreement among respondents that the quality of legal aid assistance in rural areas seems to be of lower quality because, due to the limited resources and also the lack of specialized lawyers in these areas. And now I would like to move to recommendations. So some recommendations we would like to make today, we think are very crucial to ensure that victims of trafficking are aware of their rights and can also access free legal aid that really works first and foremost in their interests and also really puts their needs at the center. So first of all, when looking at state-funded legal aid, we would recommend that lawyers should put more time in assisting and defending victims of trafficking in order to be able really to build a relationship of confidentiality. And also this work should be reflected in higher payments for these lawyers. And they also need more specialist training and qualifications. And we also think that should be a requirement for all lawyers to defend the interests and the very special needs of victims of trafficking. And particularly when we look at Romania, we also would argue that victims should be consulted by one lawyer only who's really familiar with their case and doesn't change throughout the process and assists them throughout the entire proceedings. And then when it comes to criminal proceedings, we also argue that trials need to be more victim-oriented and they have to guarantee that victims' rights and identity are protected. So personal information should not be released on the internet. And also we think that judges and other law enforcement staff need to be trained in the sphere of human trafficking. And then now, when it comes to legal aid provided by NGOs, we recommend that NGOs need more, they need accessible funds, and those legal practitioners who work in NGOs, really need to have their role strengthened when they legally assist victims of trafficking. And then looking at the role of victim identification, we also argue that NGOs should be enabled to identify and inform victims about their basic rights, because as we have seen, identification is the key criteria for victims' entitlement to free legal aid in all these countries. And now lastly, in terms of directions for future research, we, as Anta mentioned before, we couldn't interview victims themselves, but we do believe in order to better understand and improve the legal aid support for victims of trafficking, it would be necessary to conduct interviews with victims of trafficking in order to shed light what are the challenges, but also the good practices of legal aid support from their perspective. And as I mentioned, we tried to identify some geographical differences, but again, more research is really needed to understand the reasons why in some countries the regional location seems to affect the quality of legal aid for victims of trafficking, such as in Spain, but not in others, for instance, in Albania. And then in some of these selected countries, we also noticed that respondents were more knowledgeable about the availability and when it comes to legal assistance for repatriated victims. And again, this is an area that definitely needs more research. But there's so many unanswered questions, such as what does the legal aid support really look like in the country of return? What are the differences, similarities in a European country, but also in a non-European country? So we really hope that this research provides a good foundation for future research in this area. And we all can work together in order to really improve the legal aid support for victims of trafficking in the long term. Thank you. Back to
Okay.
Renate.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Diane, and also the rest of the team from St Mary's University, Carol and Anta. I'm now going to call upon participants from each of the 6 countries that were part of this study to give their reflections on the research and how they experienced it really in their country and what their thoughts are. So I'm going to start with Albania, with Miliam Demushaj from Different and Equal in Albania.
Thank you, Mary. Hello to everyone. Firstly, I want to thank and congratulate Renate Network and Bakita Center for conducting this important research, and also for giving the opportunity to give my input on such important issue. Considering the fact that detailed information for the situation of legal aid in Albania is given in the report, I will continue directly with some notes on the regulation on the internal legal framework and some challenges for the implementation in practice. Recently, Albania is implementing an extensive reform in justice system, and this reform has affected the measures taken against trafficking in human beings, including the protection of victims of trafficking through improvements of legal aid procedures. The most important legal acts that regulate free legal aid and the rights of victims in Albania are the Criminal Procedure Code, amended lately in 2017, and we have a new law, 111, the number of the law, approved in 2017 on legal aid guaranteed by the state. These recent amendments and the new law, the amendments to the Criminal Procedure Code have certainly improved the position of victims of trafficking by enhancing the framework of their rights. At the same time, it should be noted that Criminal Procedure Code provides protection and legal aid only for accusing victims who have reported trafficking and are actively participating in the process. In all other cases, for victims of trafficking, legal aid is regulated by the law on legal aid and guaranteed by the state. According to this law, all victims, whether Albanian nationals or foreign nationals, can access legal aid irrespective of their status of type of exploitation. However, despite the prescribed rights in law, the implementation in practice of these rights remains a challenge, not only for Albania, I see the report, but we have several challenges facing now in implementing the measures for the legal aid. The newly set up scheme established by the law, although it is an important advancement from a pragmatic point of view, it does not necessarily guarantee effective legal aid and protection for victims of trafficking. Looking through the eyes of survivors of trafficking, despite the special status given to them, they are not accepted from the bureaucratic procedures. Victims are required to fill a set of conditions and documents for receiving free legal aid, which might be difficult or impossible due to the special circumstances, for example, like the situation created by COVID-19. Authorized NGOs that are part of the national scheme to provide legal assistance can be financially supported by the state only for providing primarily legal aid. This creates a significant gap in terms of provision for secondary legal aid, including representation in court. The procedure for obtaining the status of victims of trafficking remains unclear and flawed. The decision of Council Minister that regulates the standard operation procedures fails to include the appeal right in case of refusal of status after the formal interview for victims of trafficking. The right to compensation for victims of trafficking in Albania is particularly challenging and followed by complicated procedures. Law enforcement agencies, including courts, prosecution office, and police, remain oriented to the perpetrator, ignoring the victim-centered approach. As a conclusion, I want to emphasize that free legal aid is not only an important basic right for the protection of victims, but it is a precondition for the fulfillment of other rights also. Based on the findings on the Renata report and the challenges mentioned above, I think it's time to undertake important joint measures in order to improve the situation of legal aid for victims of trafficking in our countries. The organization Different and Equal, in collaboration with other NGOs, has advocated for an initiative to draft a new special law for the protection of victims of trafficking. This law could serve as an integral act that ensures the protection of victims of trafficking, including the rights for legal aid. Other deep analysis and research is needed in terms of improving the access to justice and legal aid for victims of trafficking nationally and internationally. I want to conclude here, and I open if there is a question or anything else. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Milan.
You're on mute, Mary.
Hang on. Thank you very much, Milan, for that reflection. I'm now going to move to Bulgaria, to Dilyana Giteva from First Project. Dilyana.
Thank you. Within 3 minutes, I will try to inform the audience about the main findings of the report concerning Bulgaria. The report points out the good development during the last years, especially the good development following the EU accession of Bulgaria and the efforts of the authorities to make the national legislation in accordance with the European Union directives, trafficking directive, victims directives, etc. And also the report also points out the difficulties and obstacles in the access to legal aid, respectively how it affects the access to justice of survivors of human trafficking. The important legislative instruments in Bulgaria are the Criminal Code, the Criminal Procedure Code, the Action Against Human Trafficking Act, the Legal Aid Act, and the Assistance and Compensation Act. The important provisions of the Criminal Code are the provisions concerning trafficking, Articles 159, etc. About the obstacles, obstacles to the access to legal aid, which the report identifies, the barriers are connected with the capacity of the institutions, capacity of the staff to identify the victims of trafficking, especially among particularly vulnerable individuals. These difficulties in detecting the potential victims actually affect their access to legal aid. Here, the report also identifies the lack of sensitivity towards the victims of trafficking and the little knowledge about the social and psychological impact which the trafficking have over the victims. Here also we can access that if the victims, here also we have to point that if the victims are not detected, they will be unable to access legal aid. And also if they're not identified, they cannot be informed about their rights. Very important point in the report is the fact that the corruption among law enforcement staff affects the rights of the victims of human trafficking. Talking about corruption in Bulgaria, the report relies on the 2020 country report on human rights practices about Bulgaria of the US Department of State, where such an issue is identified in Bulgaria and reflects on the investigation and justice concerning cases of human trafficking. Very important aspect of the report is also the lack of specific knowledge of the officers, but also the lack of specific knowledge of other interested parties. And on the other hand, the report pays attention to the quality, to the access and quality of free legal aid provided by the National Legal Aid Bureau, and that there are some obstacles to such legal aid for victims who are not, who doesn't speak the language, who are illiterate. Because this procedure has some specific requirements and some administrative requirements, which are very difficult for the victims to be met. Here, I would prefer to stop, and I will be happy to answer if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Juliana. And now I'll call on Sister Mary Agnes from London, from Bakita House, Caritas Bakita House in England.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me for this great day. First of all, human trafficking as a crime that infringes on human rights, denies its victim the fundamental acceptable freedom and human dignity, is undoubtedly a serious criminal justice issue. According to Global Slavery Index report published in 2008, there are about 136,000 victims of human slavery in the UK. And this year, about 10,616 has been referred to the National Referral Mechanism. As a support worker, these numbers have names. When they come to the safe house, our usual instinct is always to support them, find them every support and assistance that will enable them to feel human and be human without further trauma. Although potential victims who are formally identified are given free access to legal advice, there are those with fragile immigration status with limited rights who suddenly found themselves in a terrible mess, need legal advice to be able to stabilize their stay and access protection, access assistance, support that will make them recover from their traumatic experience of trafficking. Others may need legal assistance to assess required needs, such as secure and safe accommodation and compensation. And yet, we are faced with significant challenges with every new arrival because of insufficient legal aid. For example, in London, with the number of safe houses around, the waiting time for the initial appointment for legal advice is enormous. This is due to limited number of solicitors who accept clients with legal aids. There's also a problem of regional variation, which leads to long distance journey to access legal advice. This undermines the traumatic trafficking experience of these victims and hinders a smooth journey to full recovery and to maximize the risk of being re-trafficked and re-exploited. This is not peculiar to London. It's across the country in the UK. Once a client asked me, would I ever smile again? I confidently said yes, as if I had all the answers. Yes, we want to accompany them on the journey to full recovery, to rebuild their lives, regain their human dignity. But we cannot do this without a proper implementation of a legal system that is accessible to all who need them. Some of these victims that come from abroad, like there are many who are not British nationals, they need this assistance to be able to understand, for instance, what the NRM is before they can accept, well informed to be part of it. That is me. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me in this medium.
Thank you, Mary Agnes. Thank you for sticking to time. That's great. My next call on Germany to Monica Gertzinger from Solwadi.
Hello to everyone. Good morning. First of all, I want to thank you for the invitation. I want to give a brief overview of the legal assistance here in Germany and the problems we are facing. Victims of human trafficking have the possibility to join on action and get free legal representation during the process and be represented during the investigation in Germany. The possibilities are there, but still most of the victims don't give a report and become witnesses at the police because of different reasons. And then they are not officially identified as victims of human trafficking. But the identification of victims is essential in order for them to assess support as legal aid. The biggest problem we face is that we have a lot of victims of human trafficking which apply for asylum, where they get refusing. And for this process, foreign law process, they don't get any legal assistance and help. Most of the time we are going to pay for that from the donation of our counseling centers. In case victims decide to report and go to the police, most of the investigation cases are closed, and there are only a very few cases which lead to a trial at the court. Courts leading to delay in bringing cases to trial and protect court cases. For example, in one case we waited 11 years until it took place. And at that time, the Criminal Act as forced prostitution had already became time-barred. And other cases, the case was dismissed because the human trafficker already had been deported to the country of origin. So the possibilities are there, but we don't see a big effort. And victims of human trafficking have also the right of compensation, whether through the criminal trial or through the civil or labor court. But it's very hard to meet the demand. We from Solwadi Berlin, over all the years, we have not one case we can tell about effective access to state compensation. It's just hard to meet the demand. Often the Criminal Act had not happened in Germany, but in other European countries. So all that clients doesn't fulfill the requirement. Or another reason is often they can't give enough evidence, or there is no official proof Criminal Act. And for example, in one case, the woman got HIV during the Criminal Act, but it was just too hard to prove because there are no medicine certificate from the home country of origin, that she was healthy at the time of coming to Germany. So the main problem is that we see here a very vulnerable group of victims of human trafficking, which don't get the access and help and the legal assistance because they are not officially identified as victims of human trafficking. And NGOs in Germany doesn't have any formal role in the identification of victims of human trafficking in most of the federal states. Yeah, that's my conclusion. Thank you for hearing. I'm glad to hear your questions later.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Monica. And now I'm going to go to Spain, to Cristina Manzanedo from ODOS or Fundación ACA, Spain. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Excellent to be with all of you today. And thank you for this comparative research, which help us enormously to understand the main barriers to effective legal aid for victims across Europe. I think it's fair to say that the report points out continuous efforts by governments to eliminate human trafficking, but very poor results. First, I have two general comments about the report. First general comment is that I have found it very interesting to learn about barriers in other European countries and see that many of those barriers are shared barriers, which makes me aware of the European dimension of the challenge that brings us together today and the need to collaborate at the European level. And my second general comment is that I think the report is also a powerful advocacy tool, and that I hope that the research is widely distributed and known among bar associations and prosecutors in the countries of the report, as well as the European Commission and the European Parliament. In this sense, I have a question. I would like to ask the Renate Law Group if any communication and advocacy strategy will follow the report. Now, regarding the contents of the report, regarding legal assistance, the study shows disparities in legal aid for victims of trafficking, but some of them are shared barriers. From a victim-centered approach and from my experience with migrant African women that cross the Mediterranean, this is with my experience is mainly with trafficking at earlier stages of exploitation in Europe. I have chosen 4 topics mentioned in the report for most of the countries. The first one is the detection of potential victims, the issue of who identifies potential victims, who decides, how does the identification process take place, which is the criteria used. I think, as the report rightly says, the statistics are just a shadow of the truth. And as the report also says, identification is key for entitlement to free legal aid. So I fully endorse the recommendation that NGOs are also allowed to identify victims. I think this is very relevant. Second, another issue that I think is very relevant is the importance of legal assistance, not only at the criminal stages, but before. The importance of legal assistance throughout the recovery and the reflection period, and legal assistance not only as potential victims of trafficking, but also as potential asylum seekers, because many victims have indeed an asylum case. Third, the need of trust and the need of time. The report mentions the need that the victims gain some trust in the system, but I would also say that it's also important that the victims establish some relationship of trust with someone from the system, usually NGOs, lawyer, because lack of trust is a barrier to disclosure. The need of trust, and this takes time. And finally, another very relevant issue I would like to highlight is that how can we assure more and more trained and specialized lawyers in trafficking? Now, I think the report gives several clues about how can victims be better served by lawyers. Thanks very much for letting me share these thoughts today, and I look forward to the fruits of this discussion.
Thank you very much, Christina. I'm now going to move on to Romania, to Stefan Coman, to give the reflection from the International Justice Mission of Romania.
Thank you, Mary. Hello, everyone. And thank you for everyone that put in a lot of work on this report. We definitely appreciate it. In terms of Romania, I will start with the conclusion. We have systems in place to ensure victim assistance, legal assistance, but they are ineffective. Basically, a lot of our systems are put in place because of EU directives. We have a special law on anti-trafficking. We have a special law on rights of victims. But because of the issues outlined before in the study, these extended rights of victims of trafficking can't be accessed by the victims. The main reason is because they don't know about it, and the second reason is because the systems put in place were put in place because we had to put them in place, but nobody actually took much time to evaluate them and to make them better. So one issue is, I'm guessing this is the system in a lot of countries, but probably not all. The prosecutor is the one that handles the conviction of the traffickers, that needs to prove the crime existed. And there is a lawyer that should be appointed by the state that will fight for the rights of the victim. And those rights include compensation, which is different to damages. It's basically taking money in advance to make sure she has enough money for food and board and emergency services. That lawyer also needs to make sure that that victim's identity is protected, that she has that reflection period of 90 days. And oftentimes, the lawyer that is appointed by the state goes and represents the victim in court, but doesn't talk to the victim. And if it's a minor from an orphanage or the social care system, oftentimes doesn't even talk to the legal guardian, which actually is the director of the placement center. So these rights exist, but they're not really effective because the system doesn't give incentives to lawyers to fight for the victims. One example I can give you is that several years ago, I think it was 4 or 5 years ago, there was a European project that trained 20 lawyers and specialized them in handling human trafficking cases. Because most lawyers don't know about the special law on trafficking, the special law on rights of victims of violence, and these things make a difference. Out of the 20 lawyers that were trained, there's about 3 or 4 still taking anti-trafficking cases. The rest have gone into commercial law or other types of practices that are more profitable for them. So basically that investment went out the window. Most victims that have effective legal aid have it because they work with NGOs, like you obviously showed in the study. And oftentimes, NGOs have more expertise on legal assistance for victims than the lawyers that studied law and have a law degree, because they know the system, they know what works, and they know what doesn't work. There are also some issues in the system because a victim has a 90-day reflection period where she needs to be left alone. And after 90 days, authorities can contact them. But she needs to file a report 60 days after the exploitation ended. So that 90 days gets shortened, and there's a little bit of a conflict there. So there are some administrative tweaks, but generally I would say these systems need to be evaluated, improved, incentives need to be given to the lawyers. And what we're trying to advocate for is only lawyers that have had a course in anti-trafficking in the last 2 years to be able to take on a case. And for that lawyer, we want that lawyer to take on the case even if there's an appeal, because oftentimes there's a lawyer in the first stage of trial, and then in the appeal there's another lawyer, and in compensation there's another lawyer. And also some system that is put into place so that a lawyer that assists a victim of trafficking can't simultaneously assist a trafficker on, let's say, traffic violation laws. So basically, oftentimes, because the traffickers have a lot of money and the victims don't, traffickers will hire that lawyer for different offenses, but they'll hire the same lawyer that the victim has. And obviously, there's no exchange of information there, but it is something that concerns us. So, and I would like to point out one other issue. For external trafficking, because Romania is mostly known as a source country, if there's a Romanian group or Romanian person that's exploited, let's say in the UK, oftentimes the trial will take place in the UK and the victim will be repatriated to Romania. There's already a huge barrier for victims to actually understand their own rights and what they can do. The barrier gets much bigger when the legal proceedings happen in another country. They don't know about compensation rights. They don't know exactly about the fact that they can testify in Romania, in a court in Romania, or that they can go to the UK to testify. There's all these kind of other things that make legal assistance and access to legal rights more difficult. So to close out, I think, obviously, like we always say, we need a more victim-centered approach, a multidisciplinary approach. We need better collaboration between destination and source countries, and all our systems need to be evaluated to see if they are effective in assisting victims, and not just to put in reports to say, well, we have all these systems in place and we're good. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stefan. And thank you to all the, muted myself. Thank you to all the contributors from the different countries. It's very useful, I think, for the researchers to get that feedback from the people who are on the front line as to how they have read the report and how they find it will be useful in the future. We're going to move on to a panel discussion now, where the panel will consist of the 3 people from St Mary's University and 3 members of the Renata Task Group. They are Begona from Spain, Diliana from Bulgaria, and Annie Bannister from England. But before we move on to that, what we're going to give you is 2 or 3 minutes for reflection. So there will be some silence while you can think of questions that you want to ask and put them into the chat line or into the Q&A line, whichever you find most convenient. As I said earlier, if you find you can't express it so easily in English, you can put it in your language, and we hope that somebody else here who speaks that language will be able to do a translation for us. So we're now going to have 3 minutes while you have time to focus your questions and put them into this chat line, and then we'll have the panel discussion. And I think we're going to, are we going to have a picture or something while we do that on the screen, or? Yeah, okay. So that's just basically reminding you also to put into the chat box if you have any questions. So I'm going to give you all 2 minutes now. You both should have been thinking whilst you were hearing the presentations. Okay, everybody, you've had 2 minutes and we have some questions that have come in. So whilst we're answering those, people can still add other questions if they have them. And what I'm going to do is pick the questions and then address it to this Mary's team first and then to the law task group afterwards, and you can decide amongst yourselves who's going to answer each bit of each question. The first question comes from Ruth van Dijk, which was, were there differences in access or quality of assistance, legal assistance between child and adult victims of trafficking?
Maybe I can start answering this question. So we haven't looked particularly at the differences, but based on the literature review, I can say, for instance, in terms of the German context, there's no child-oriented procedure in place to identify child victims, and therefore, yes.
Yeah. Can you talk up a bit higher, because it's a bit difficult to hear, sorry.
Yeah. So I said in the German context, and based on the literature review, so we could find that there's no child-oriented assistance really in place at the national level. And in fact, we have also found that the German government doesn't really recognize child trafficking explicitly as a type of trafficking. So this also means that there's no special identification and signposting to any assistance for children. So this is my,
Do you think that that's something that should be addressed at kind of European level in terms of making definitions on child trafficking, as opposed to each country having different definitions?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's always good to have sort of a shared understanding, and also learn from other countries how they, provide.
Thank you. Is there anybody from the Law Task Group want to say anything on that? Because I know that Renata did some research on child trafficking.
Yes, I would like to say something about this issue in Bulgarian context. Actually, it's a very important aspect of the protection of victims because, as you know, children are by presumption victims with specific needs, which means that there is a necessity to have some additional skills when you work with victims in order to avoid any secondary, for example, victimization. And in Bulgarian context, this is one of the huge problems because we have some procedural guarantees for victims with specific needs within the Criminal Procedure Code. But there is one very important issue that the court differentiates between children of age under 14 and children of age above 14. And according to the penal code, the children of age above 14 are kind of equal to adults. According to this code, which is a problem because nor the Convention on the Rights of the Child, neither the European Union directives differentiating the age of children. All these instruments say children are people on age under 18, and there is no difference 14, 15, 16, etc. And another very important aspect here I would like to point out, which is an issue for Bulgaria, but it might be issue also for other countries, is identification of the age of the victims, of the age of survivors. Actually, in Bulgaria, it's a huge issue when it is connected with migrant children. And in many cases, our authorities are not, doesn't have enough skills to provide the necessary protection for the children, but also they don't have the necessary skills to identify the migrant children, which might be trafficked. So it's very, very good question about the children, and thank you for Ruth for asking this question.
And I think Begona has something to add on that. Begona, can I hand over?
I think in Spain it's a bit the same thing. It depends, and it depends if it's for sexual abuse. Then minors are even in worse situation, except when they are from 15 till 18, if they are recognized as minors, because as Liliana said, that's a big problem. But when it's in the case of they are forced to commit crimes or for begging, that's another answer. But I will ask maybe Cristina Manzanedo that she can answer the question. Maybe she has more experience in Spain. I have more experience in France than in Spain about that.
Christina, did you want to say something on that?
Yeah.
No.
But I think that would merit another, maybe that's also a future line of research, because usually minors are with an adult, women.
Yeah.
And what happened with, and usually it is the women that is foreseen as a victim, but maybe the child approach is missing in the context of trafficking. I would suggest maybe to include it as a future line of research.
Okay, thank you very much. Anybody from the St Mary's want to come back on that, or shall we move on to another question? Carol, yes.
Yeah, just to say that it becomes problematic when the child is defined differently in different countries, in terms of age and how people fit into that. So, I mean, that's not to say that it's impossible to do, but I do agree with, I'm sorry, I don't know your first name, is it Christina Manzaneto?
Yeah.
Christina, in terms of it certainly is a focus for a future piece of research.
Okay, thank you very much. I have another question from Mark Wiggin, which was two parts really. What did the panel consider the single most important reform of local legal support, or the most important action that could come out as a result of this report? So I'm going to go to the Law Task Group first, and then we'll come back to St Mary's. Okay, the Law Task Group, have you got any thoughts on what you consider the most important action that could come out of this report for Renata, as Renata commissioned it?
If I may speak, Mary.
Annie, yes.
Hello. So I cover the UK, and in this instance, for the report, it was England and Wales. And one of the big things that was mentioned by Mary Agnes was there's 136,000 suspected victims of trafficking in the UK, but only 10 to 11,000 are actually identified. And I think getting people to talk more about identification of those trafficking victims, so we can then get some legal help to them, would be an extremely important action to come out of this research. A second one, of course, is about accessibility. That generally victims of trafficking are very reluctant to engage with authorities. They see lawyers and legal people as a step very removed from them. So trying to bridge that gap to make accessibility to legal assistance, be it through formal legal aid or not, would be an extremely important action out of this as well.
Thank you. Begona, you wanted to say something as well.
Yes, I think that for me, one of the important follow-up is what Christina has presented. Who identifies the victim? Because I think that's one of the things that to allow that NGOs, I mean, to work towards NGOs can be allowed, who have been following the person, can be allowed to identify the person, the victim. I think that that's something very important, because if it's like in the case of Spain, only the police that can recognize, identify them, it's very difficult for them. And there is a minority that is identified only.
Okay. And anybody from St Mary's wish to comment on that?
Maybe I can just come in, and I wanted to actually echo what Stefan from IGM Romania mentioned. So in terms of action, it'll be crucial to evaluate all the practices that we have at the moment. I think we are all doing brilliantly on paper and in terms of legal frameworks, and we are all equipped. But in terms of implementation of some of these frameworks, we have still a lot more work to do in order to make legal aid more accessible, more understood, and obviously have a better quality of the support that we give.
Thank you. I had a question because on the chat we haven't got any more, and we haven't got a lot of time, but are you planning to extend this research into other countries or other kind of areas? Because you mentioned the need for further research, and it seems to me that this report will be incredibly valuable to the people in the countries which were based on the report, but there may be other people at this meeting from other countries who would be very interested for further research and could communicate directly with St Mary's, with the Bakita Centre. So over to you, Anta.
I mean, we are always open to work with practitioners, as I said, and we value partnership working. Obviously, this is always subject to funding, unfortunately, but we are hoping that we stay in close contact with Renata, and maybe we have further conversations for extending this research and going further or deeper, for example. But yeah, we hope it's the short answer, but maybe Carol also wants to come in.
Yes, Carol, do you want a word?
Yeah, yes, I've just noticed a comment in the chat as well, actually. Veronica Lupu from Moldova is saying that other countries could do with some kind of exploration. And I think, you know, going forward, it would be really useful for us to look together at sources of funding to carry this research forward, because it was a scoping review. It was very time constrained. And I think considering that, the product it has been really exemplary because of the research and the contacts that you have, and to be able to build on that would be fantastic, I think, and would be a really key piece of research. But again, going back to what a few people said, is then about action. What happens next? How do we kind of challenge the status quo in these countries who state that they're doing all sorts of wonderful things for victims of human trafficking, but on the ground they're not?
Okay. Thank you very much. And I think time is pressing on, so I'm going to have to draw this panel discussion to a close. It's obvious that, sorry, but Imelda, you wanted to say something.
Yes, excuse me, Mary. I'm just very conscious that we have people online in countries where we do not have members. So it would be really, really useful. We've got Veronica's email, so I will contact Veronica and invite her to join Renata, because we do not have a member from Moldova. We have been to Moldova, we've met some of your NGOs, but we haven't actually got a membership there. So that would be really, really helpful to extend this work, because Moldova is very important because of the high level of trafficking from Moldova.
Could you put the Renata website into the chat line, just so that people can contact Renata if they want to explore further work? And also the website will have the report on it after this webinar. And
Mary, sorry for interrupting you, but there is a problem for the panel, because we in this particular webinar, the way it's set up, sadly, we're not able to chat to everybody. So if somebody out there from Renata could put into the chat the website for Renata. Has it already gone in?
It's gone in now, yes. Annie Bannister's put it in. So it's in the chat line. That's just appeared. And the website, so that's great. Yeah. So I'm going to say that this has been a really interesting and challenging and useful presentation, but also, like most research, opens up lots of possibilities for further research. I would like to thank all those people who've prepared this, who've organised it, who've worked on the tech side, and who've participated. I pity I can't see all your faces. It would be nice to be able to, but I know we want to take a photograph of everybody. So Brian, I'm hoping that that's possible. Is that right? Yeah. So if you don't want to be photographed, switch your camera off. now, but keep the sound on because we want to just finish off by handing to thank everybody for participating. In the meantime, there will be a follow-up survey to all those who participated so that we can make our presentations even better in the future. So at this point, I will hand over to Imelda to finally sum up and thank everybody.
Well, it's been a remarkable webinar, and thank you very much first to St. Mary's. And you really inspired me with your inputs, because you just showed how committed, not just for the information, but the commitment to this work against human trafficking as human beings who could feel the injustice. And I was really inspired, and thank you, DM2, for making your input so very clear in terms of recommendations, needs, good practice, and where we can go further with this. It was beautifully done. Probably the best input from a research person that I've heard in a webinar, so thank you. And also thank you to the 6 who spoke from the 6 countries. It was inspirational to really flit around Europe and to feel the problems and the issues that you are all facing in your grassroots work. And finally, Mary and the technical people and the panelists who answered the questions and you people that were picking up on the questions. What a team we have in Renata, and how could we function without it? Thanks to Anne Kelleher, who beavers away in the background doing the minutes and ensuring. And finally, I would like to thank Brian O'Toole, who actually kept the show on the road for us throughout. And really, you did a most remarkable job to keep us going, you know, even in difficult times. So thanks everybody, and let us go forward. Let us not see this as the finish. No way. It's a tiny beginning to tip into the iceberg, really, of terrible practice going on, which is not serving the victims and survivors of human trafficking. So let's continue the journey and feel passionate and inspirational in our work in this field. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, and
thank you.
Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Everyone, bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.